All right, so these notes are for ninth grade history. And ninth graders, I gave you the copy of these notes. So you should be highlighting along as I talk through the notes, highlighting the key words. Um, and if you forgot, these notes are in your Unit 2 section of your red history binder. These notes are going to be about disease, crime, and punishment in the Middle Ages. So, in the Middle Ages, disease was a big problem because towns were unhealthy. And I want to clarify that this is in Europe still. So, towns were very unhealthy for a couple of reasons. First, there wasn't a sanitary way to dispose of waste. So, for example, today, when you go to the bathroom, you use a toilet. In the Middle Ages, they had a little pot in their bedroom or in their house, and they would use that. And then when it was full, they would dump it out their window into the streets. So, so trash and other waste were tossed into the streets and water supplies, and there wasn't a sewage system that kept the sewage stuff separate from the water that they used to drink and cook with. So you can imagine how gross their water was. And then on top of that, rats and fleas carried disease. So, and there were a lot of rats and a lot of fleas. Not many people bathed very often. So, people today typically shower, if not every day, every other day, and were pretty hygienic. In the Middle Ages, people didn't shower. So, maybe they wash themselves like every couple of months, and what that would look like is the whole family would get together and fill up a tub of water, and they would use that to wash themselves. And they didn't refill it every time for every person. They just used whatever water was left after the person before them went. And usually they would go in order of oldest to youngest. So if you've heard the phrase, don't toss the baby out with the bathwater, it's because usually the babies were bathed last. And then by that time, the water in the tub was so dirty that you couldn't really tell if there was something else in it. So again, checking to make sure that you didn't throw the baby out with all of the bathwater. So again, disease was a huge problem. Another problem is that medicine was not very advanced. So when he did get sick, medicine was not very advanced, and you're going to see that in the skit on Friday. And part of it is doctors didn't know how to cure many common diseases. So diseases like measles, cholera, smallpox, scarlet fever, leprosy, they didn't know how to cure those. And their cures mostly looked like praying. So sometimes doctors would just pray. They would use herbs to help heal, and sometimes that helps. So if if you're stuffed up and your nose is congested, sometimes rubbing a little peppermint oil underneath it kind of helps clear it up a little bit. It doesn't make you better, but it makes the symptoms a little bit better. So herbs were probably one of the best ways, or best medicines in the Middle Ages, but again, still not very good. Doctors would use astrology to help them decide on what medicines to use. So like astrology is like your star sign. So if you were born in March, you're in Aries. If you were born in November, I think you're like Scorpio or Sagittarius. So if two people came in and they both had a fever, the doctor would ask them when they were born, and depending on when they were born, they would use a different medicine to treat them. So depending on their star sign. So again, for the same illness, they might use different treatments depending on their star sign. One of the most common medicines was using leeches or a knife to bloodlet. So bloodletting is bleeding the patient to get rid of the bad blood. So they believed that people who were sick just had bad blood and they needed to let it out. So they would make a little small cut on someone's arm, and you can actually see that in the picture on the video of a doctor cutting this man's arm and kind of letting the blood run into the bowl. They would also put leeches on you to do the same thing, to draw out blood. Now, for bruises, that's not a bad thing because it helps take the blood out. And bruises are, just blood swelling in a certain area in your body. But blood also does a lot of good things for you. So for things like a fever, if you're bloodletting someone, you're actually making it harder for them to get better. So a lot of times the treatments kind of made it worse. Another reason why disease was common. Now, for crime and punishment, so even with the feudal system and lords creating laws and punishments, crime was still a big problem, and there still wasn't like a police force. So there wasn't a lot of law enforcement. So what that means is medieval towns would try to humiliate people who committed crimes. So they would humiliate people who committed crimes to try and stop anyone else from committing the crime as well. Now, in the early Middle Ages, they had two different ways to figure out if you were guilty or innocent. And this was called a trial by combat or a trial by ordeal to determine guilt or innocence. So trial by combat would be you would go and sorry about that. So trial by combat is where you would, if you were accused of a crime, you could fight the person who accused you. And if you won, it meant you were innocent. And if they won, it meant you were guilty. So again, not a really good way to figure out if someone's innocent or guilty for a crime. And then trial by ordeal, again, if you were accused by a crime, they would put you through an ordeal or like a trial where maybe if you were, say, accused of being a witch, they would tie your legs and arms together and throw you in a river. And if you sank, you were innocent. And if you floated, you were guilty of being a witch. Now, if you sink, you're probably drowning because nobody knew how to swim and your arms and legs are tied together. And if you floated, it meant you were guilty of being a witch. So you were either burned at the stake or hung. And actually, it was more common to hang witches than burn them. So again, not really good ways to figure out if people are innocent or guilty because it doesn't actually look at evidence of the crime. So later on, in about the 1100s, they started switching to courts. So they would have judges listen to evidence. So it looks a little bit more like what we had today, where lawyers will present evidence to the judge and sometimes jury, but juries weren't around yet. So lawyers would present evidence to judges, and judges would listen to the evidence to decide if someone had committed a crime. So a little bit fairer than trial by combat or trial by ordeal. If someone was found guilty, the punishments were really brutal. And again, they were intended to punish the guilty and scare others from committing crimes. So some common punishments included putting you in the stocks. So the stocks would be this wooden device out in the middle of the town square where everyone's going to go. And you spend like 12 hours there or maybe a whole day, depending on the crime you committed. And they would... so you couldn't move and you were stuck there, and oftentimes crowds would gather and tease you and taunt you and maybe throw some rotten vegetables at you. So again, it's more about humiliating you or humiliating the criminal than actually like punishing them. I mean, it's still a pretty bad punishment. Another common punishment was hanging someone or burning them at the stake. So this is a picture of the medieval stocks. So the man in the middle, you can see his feet are stuck and his hands are stuck through holes. So he can't escape, and he's just got to sit there and take it. So again, punishments in the Middle Ages were very brutal and harsh to make sure that other people would be afraid of committing the crime because they didn't want to get humiliated in front of everyone. So kind of a modern day comparison is, if you don't do your homework, you go to after school. But if we were in the Middle Ages, if you didn't do your homework, maybe we would put you in stocks in the middle of the green and put you there all day long, and people could tease you and taunt you and throw stuff at you because you didn't do something or you broke a law or something. All right. And that is it for disease, crime, and punishment.